everybody. I am not Sarah Barnes-Humphrey, unfortunately for you. The good news is, let me get my glasses. The good news is I was lucky enough to be involved in putting together some of this content over the last couple months with Chelsea and Caroline, so I know a little about what we're talking about, and I've been lucky enough to either work with or somewhat competitively against everybody up here. So thank you guys for coming, for taking time out of your busy schedules to lend your attention and your thoughts. As Larry said, you're thought leaders in the industry. And we are really excited about doing things differently and getting outside opinions and trying to see solutions where, to align with our theme, only chaos seems to abound. You guys are in luck today because the guys sitting up here are quite literally titans of industry. They're touching millions, tens of millions of containers from a supply chain perspective, and they're most excitingly doing things in an innovative fashion that's never been done, and some of them are doing it at massive scale, which we're going to talk about. They're going to lend their expertise, their insight. Much like me, I think most of these guys aren't trained to do anything else, so they know their shit. Sorry for the entree on the start, but it's true. They've progressed in their careers and with their organizations because of how they're pushing the envelope, and we want that to be the theme of today. Let me give you some kind of context in 2022 of what we're dealing with. Our theme is connection through chaos. There have been massive cycles of disruption. Remember back in the day when we got very excited about a ship getting sideways in the Suez? Then we have a pandemic, and then we still are at this, people say, this new normal, this new level, which means daily disruptions to our lives, to the ways we do business, and especially how we move goods, how our workforce goes to work every day. It's completely different than it was 3 or 4 years ago. And that, from an industry perspective, is one of the most exciting things I think I've ever seen in my 22 years doing this business. Here's some context. Our marine terminals, and I know a lot of you guys in this room don't know some of the acronyms you're going to hear today, so I'm going to try to give you some context on this. Our marine container terminals that touch the ships, that unload those ships and get that most of our goods, 85% of our goods, most of what you're wearing into the country, they're at about 90% capacity, and they've been that way for years. The motor carriers, the people who own the trucks and move the goods, have near zero capacity to provide drivers to move those goods. So congestion is higher at every stage of the supply chain than we've ever seen. That means driver capacity to move a hot load or something that's important that needs to be on a shelf is very difficult, so the costs are rising. We've heard today about platforms. All of these intricate links together don't really work when people have to pull levers and move buttons. And so when you have limited capacity of drivers, you have very high demand, costs are up, delays are up, congestion is up. We are estimating that this congestion is causing per year now a $12 billion increase in the demurrage that's charged, the penalty fees that are charged on cargo sitting on the docks. All of that trickles down to the consumer, the payer, who's buying the goods. And so it's a massive problem. We're here today to kind of talk about how can we, with systems that interconnect, bring back a little bit more stability and predictability by doing things a little different. So I'm going to start today, before we jump into this, you guys can read names and titles on the wall. I'd love, when before we transition this, if we could start maybe with you, Weston. Go down the line, tell us who you are, what you do, but why the organization you're with is important and how it fits into this overall supply chain to kick us off.
Sure thing. Thanks, Alan, and thank you, Larry and team, for having me here today. Weston Labar. I'm head of strategy for a company called Cargomatic. If you haven't heard of us, we're kind of like the Uber of freight. Recently valued at $1.3 billion in a Series C led by SoftBank and Tiger Global. So we won't see a press release, but happy to share amongst friends. And I think it's important because in the last 18 months, we've tripled in value. A large portion of that is because we're in this capacity-constrained climate, and big thing that we do is connect the 70% of trucking fleets that operate 10 trucks or less across local freight communities with the 200-plus shippers that move the majority of the freight, whether that be in a container or whether that be palletized freight moving from a warehouse to an e-commerce fulfillment center. And really excited to talk with you all today about the opportunities the industry brings, because for those of you who are here looking to make investments in supply chain, you've got the most essential industry in the world that literally enables everybody else to do what they do at a professional and a personal level. And you are in an extremely capacity-constrained industry, which means investment dollars will be returned and should be returned at a very high level. So hope to get to know each of you better before my 9:30 flight tonight. Sorry I missed dinner last night, but thank you for having me, and I'm excited to talk about supply chain with y'all.
Thanks, Weston. Todd?
Hey, Todd Erickschrud with Matchback Systems. Matchback Systems is a logistics software company that helps with the reuse of that empty container. So once that container has been delivered, we help optimize it for our parties. Is this on, by the way? Okay. You are. So I started my career leading a port drayage trucking company and a global 3PL business, and I realized that there is this vacuum. You have very good visibility on all this ocean freight. You have good visibility and systems on domestic transportation, and international kind of just shows up. And there's this vacuum, that needs this bright light on the whole synchronizing of that international and domestic supply chain. So I applaud Larry and the Envase team and Firmament Group for really attacking that, and that's where we play as well. Our focus is working with the trucking companies, with the 3PLs, the freight forwarders, and the shippers on helping them most efficiently move their product through the supply chain.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, thanks for the opportunity to be here and sit on this panel. I'm really excited about that, and it might be the first time I was called a titan of anything, so thanks for that, Alan. But so I work for APM Terminals, and we are the marine terminal operator for the Maersk Group. So sister company of the world's now second largest steamship line. So those containers, those ships that you all are talking about are part of what our company operates. So unlike the rest of the panel and unlike most of you in the room, I actually deal every day with the hard assets, right? So I'm dealing with containers and cranes, and the terminal really sits at that interface between the water and the land side, right? So we are the ones that are unloading the ships and delivering to the truckers coming through the gate. And every day, my job is really to figure out how it is that we maximize the use of that capacity. And so the reason why I think this is a great opportunity is the technology really is what is going to help change and grow the capability for us to maximize capacity, right? We as much of right now, the problem is not pure capacity. The problem, as much as anything else right now, is how we use the capacity we have. And so I think this panel and the discussions you all are having and the way you are thinking about changing the business will really help to solve that problem. So thanks again for giving me the opportunity.
Good morning. I'm Joel Tracy. I'm the CIO of IMC Companies. And for those of you who do not know IMC Companies, IMC is a holding company. We started 40 years ago with one truck, one driver, and we were focused on the asset side of trucking, specifically in the marine drayage space. We do not, if it's domestic, we don't touch it. It's got to be a marine drayage container, import, export type of move. We handle the inland move piece. And over the years, when we first started, the technology was not there. And so very quickly our owner realized that you would have to become a tech-savvy business to make it. Otherwise, you would spend all of your earnings in manual labor, and that wasn't going to be scalable. So he started investing in technology, and about, I'd say 20 years ago, we developed our own TMS, and we've been adding on to that ever since. But then at some point, we realized that, you know what, we're not going to be able to scale that way anymore, and so then we started partnering with companies like Envase, and we started adding on, bolting on products, the various products that Envase has around our core technology. Since then, we've now have built up to about 1,850 trucks on the asset side. We're brokering to another about 1,000 independent drivers on the brokerage side of our business. So we're running close to 2,600 to 3,000 drivers a day that we're keeping busy. We believe that we are the nation's largest marine drayage focused company, and that's also caused us to branch out into depot operations, some transloading. We're trying to figure it out. What we're trying to do is we're trying to add value where the steamship lines and the beneficial cargo owners need the help. And like Weston, we are finding ourselves to be a conduit from the big companies who need shipping to the many smaller 20 truck or less operations there are, and there are thousands of them across the United States.
Thank you, guys. That's a kind of frames what some call the first mile of this supply chain. You've got one of the largest global terminal operators here. You've got massive trucking capacity moving those goods. You've got digital marketplaces to connect buyers to sellers, to connect drivers to loads, if you will. And then you've got the optimization piece that makes it all work pretty efficiently, and they're all doing things on the leading edge. So it's a good panel to start us off. Let's start at the 50,000 foot level, coming into, if you've got goods coming into this country, most of them come into LA Long Beach. So Weston, I'm gonna start with you. Let's kind of get into the current state of things right now. There's been a ton of stuff in the media. Most folks at water coolers don't talk about supply chain issues, but over the last year and a half, that's been the topic on our tongues. There's a presidential panel or an office. The president's got his own supply chain task force, which is flittering about, putting pressure on terminal operators, which I'm sure Jack can attest to. What's the current state of things? And let's give, for example, since we know it well, the LA Long Beach situation.
Yeah, and thanks for that question, Alan. I think a lot of attention has been on LA Long Beach, and for good reason. Roughly 40% of all the goods that come in and out of the nation go through the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. You've got over 13,000 frequent calling trucks that come in and out of the port every day. And I agree with Jack that when you look at capacity, it's really relative. It's not about how many trucks you have. Capacity is not this fixed thing. Capacity is relative to how you move trucks. And where you can get better asset deployment, you can get a lot more productivity, you can move a lot more freight, you can create more capacity at the marine terminals. And I bring this up because if you're just becoming familiar with the term supply chain, which is this fragmented ecosystem of players that help get things from manufacturing centers and really into consumers' homes, I'm going to throw a little bit of a wrinkle into this. Is there's really two chains. There's the supply chain, and then there's the distribution chain. And a lot of people don't look at it that way, but if you look at some of the articles that came out recently, I'll point to a FreightWaves article talking about the quote-unquote bloodbath in trucking that's coming down the pike. It only looks at a certain segment of data that's really about outputs, but they're ignoring the input, which is the supply part of the supply chain. They're looking at what's happening within the demand, right? The distribution chain, which has been capacity constrained for quite some time. We've really seen it since the beginning of trucking deregulation in the 80s. We've saw this slow need for more and more trucks, but we're not adding them. It's funny, you know, although my son, he's 2, he's obsessed with truck books, I don't think he's actually going to grow up to want to be a truck driver for some reason. And that's the sentiment that we have throughout this nation, is people don't necessarily want their kids to be blue-collar workers. And we're even behind the 8 ball a little bit more in commercial trucking, because you can't, as an 18-year-old, go get a commercial CDL and go drive interstate across state lines. You can, in some states, do it in a local fashion, but by the time somebody may be interested in trucking as a profession, they've already gone down the rabbit hole of a trade, welder, construction worker, et cetera. Yet, with the explosion of e-commerce from the pandemic, we were at roughly 10% direct-to-consumer prior to the pandemic. That's over 25% today. You actually increase the need for trucks in your local communities, because now, instead of taking things from a distribution center to a store, you're taking things from a distribution center to thousands of homes, which means you need a lot more capacity. So again, that's where the investors in the room investing in the distribution part of the supply chain is still a very good investment, because we're not going to make that up. It's not like all of a sudden you're going to have this quote-unquote bloodbath of pricing and people going out of business. But what people really don't understand in LA Long Beach is this tidal wave of freight was turned on because manufacturing in China was shut down because of the pandemic. And because of that, we saw weeks and weeks of what we call blank sailings, meaning that they just didn't sail the ship from port A to port B. We're seeing that again. And at the time, we saw it even further impacted, because here, then, we didn't know what to do with it when it started showing up, because we shut down stores. You had municipalities say, well, the ports need to stay open, it's critical infrastructure, but warehouses, shut those down, because we don't want workers interacting with one another. Again, it's a chain of distribution. It needs to go someplace. If it can't go to a warehouse, then it's stuck at a terminal, and then you can't unload a ship. And the next thing you know, you've got over 120 ships waiting to get into the port of LA Long Beach. That's now down to roughly 40 ships, because you've seen a lot of, again, blank sailings coming from China, because we started this year with the Olympics, and the Chinese said, you know what, we don't want dirty air during the Olympics. We want people to think we're a sustainable community here in the People's Republic of China. So what are we going to do? We're going to shut down or meter down our manufacturing. So you saw an impact as to the goods flow from China to the US. And then Shenzhen province shuts down because of their zero COVID policy. And why is that important? Well, even prior to the shutdown, the manufacturing is in one part of the province, but the ports, the NTN, which is the 3rd largest port in China, and Hong Kong, which is a major export port as well, could not get goods from the Shenzhen province and inland areas where the manufacturing was happening to those ports. So you saw a huge dip in the amount of goods flowing from China to the US. And then follow that up with both Lunar New Year, where you always see a shutdown in manufacturing and a little bit of a lull in Chinese freight coming into the US, as well as 24 million people being told to stay at home in Shanghai. Again, people don't realize even before that, you couldn't go from one part of the province to the next, which meant you couldn't get from the manufacturing centers on one side of the river to the ports on the other side of the river in Shanghai, the largest port in the world, right? And so because of that, you've seen this artificial drop of the supply of goods coming into the country. Luckily, we're still busy because we're still moving things, but that mixture of goods is different. One week, I may have 500 containers for a customer, and I might not see another container for that customer for weeks, because they're not making more product. It's more of a, it's an agility contest of how you can pivot that capacity from one customer to the next. And what we look at in this country is this idea of domestic freight and the domestic trucking market taking a dip, but it's really about the fact that the makeup of goods is not a constant stream coming from China anymore. And if you look across the board, domestic truck demand was only down 0.5% nationwide. The majority of that was in Los Angeles, Long Beach, because you didn't have the same supply of goods. But trucking demand in other markets was up. It's just LA Long Beach is such a massive market that when you see anything change there up or down, it will control the entire price indications and indexes across the country. And that's really what I think you're looking at right now. Wait until manufacturing's back up and running. The next freight tsunami is on the way. The good news is it's right in the middle of an ILWU contract negotiation. and you're going to see, and that's the labor union, if you aren't aware, that operates the marine terminals on the West Coast. But early indications show that you may see as many as 200 ships waiting to get into the port come end of June, beginning of July.
Maybe, Alan, if it's okay, maybe just add some more context to what Wes was saying, just specifically around what we're seeing at the port. So I think LA Long Beach is for sure sort of the poster child for everything that's going on. But the type of congestion and delays that we're seeing in LA Long Beach is also being replicated around other parts of the country, right? So you have ships backed up in Savannah, which was unheard of. We got ships backed up in New York, which was unheard of. And as Wes said, it's down to about 40 vessels on the West Coast right now that are actually waiting for a spot and labor to work those ships. So they're sitting at anchor. The really interesting piece is there's over 300 ships that are sitting outside of Shanghai right now, idling, waiting to be loaded because of the fact that none of the cargo that they're to be loaded with is able to get to the ports because of the COVID lockdown. So you will see this ebb and flow of huge peak, nothing, huge peak, nothing for a bit while longer. The other thing that I just wanted to point out that I think is important to understand about when we talk about capacity and congestion on the West Coast is that if you look at dwell, this is the amount of time containers sit idle on the terminals, dwell time has doubled in the past year and a half. So what used to move off the terminals in 4 days now moves off the terminal in 8 to 10 days. Same thing with chassis. These are the wheels that go underneath the containers to do all this drayage. Dwell on the street for chassis has doubled in the past year and a half as well, right? So the shortage of last mile delivery is actually backing up that entire supply chain to the terminals and ultimately back onto the vessels. So.
Well, and that disruption, if I go right on, that disruption is also inland. If you start looking at some of the railroad terminals, you have challenges in Chicago and Memphis and all these other locations that are trying to coordinate these activities as well. So, to Weston's point, it's an incredibly synchronized and orchestrated process of utilizing those containers. And now when you start seeing any disruption, you're going to start finding all these challenges. The import to export ratio has changed pre-pandemic from around 2 imports to every export. Now there's about 4 imports to every export. And things just get challenged from there. The normal supply and demand of containers that goes out in the industry has significantly changed. If you think, a lot of you took an airplane to get here. When there's a disruption in the airline industry, they're going to reposition planes. It takes 3 to 5 hours to reposition them. For an ocean vessel, that's a 15 to 20 day activity for that one vessel to get back on track. So you can see of all the disruption that's going on, what the impact is and how difficult it is for the parties to work through that.
Yeah, I would like to add, to Jack's point, it is all synchronous and it does back up, but what you have the distribution centers that are backed up. And so then what we're seeing on the motor carrier side is what used to happen on an import, you'd have 2 moves. You have the loaded import to the DC, and then you'd move the empty back, right? Or you'd move the empty, maybe they'd fill it up for an export. But what we're seeing now is we're seeing a move outside of the port to a satellite yard because that DC doesn't have the space for the equipment. So then you've got to ground the box to free up the chassis so that you could continue to move freight out of the port and not cause a further backup from that 4 to 8, make it 12. And so you have all this equipment getting grounded now. And then on top of that, you got more needs for lifts. And guess what? What the lead time is on ordering a new lift? It's like 12 months. So we're putting in orders now for lifts that we will get next year. It's crazy.
Good times.
Yeah.
Good times. All right, let's pivot. That's great context on how screwed up things are. Let's pivot a little from starting at the 50,000 foot level. Weston, let's talk about the Port Authority. Yep. All right, so that's the first, on West Coast, really everywhere other than South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, all these port authorities just lend space to folks like APMT, and they come in and...
They don't lend it. They definitely charge for it.
All right. lease. But the port authorities still play a big role. Maybe that's a misconception, given the voices we've got in LA Long Beach. But what do you see the port authorities being more passive participants in this whole thing, just doing media play, or do they really have a role? Are they making an impact here to ease this disruption?
Yeah, so that's a loaded question.
That's why I asked.
So just so everybody knows, so there's really two different types of port authorities. You have an operating port, like the Port of Savannah, where the longshoremen are state employees, and they operate the terminal. The majority of marine terminal or port authorities, and this is the case up and down the West Coast, are what's called landlord ports. They essentially operate the land in stewardship of the government. So if you look at, in the state of California owns all of that land on the coastal area. It's called the tidelands. And then each local community has the jurisdiction to run that on behalf of the state. And you have, for instance, the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach, and they're there as trustees of that state land, and they create very long lease agreements up to 66 years. And within those lease agreements, they can or cannot specify how somebody operates. And traditionally, that's all they were, is a landlord. And in some cases, some people might say a slumlord, because they didn't even pave the property or invest in technology or do much of anything but provide dirt. I think that part has changed. You've seen incredible infrastructure investments on the part of ports, working with tenants, and I know Maersk has seen that with APM Terminals Pier 400 in the Port of Los Angeles. But more recently, you've probably seen, if you watch at all anything about supply chain or read anything, Port Authority is getting more engaged with trying to take a lead in really a thought leadership role as to how things should work. Getting much more involved in digital infrastructure, and I think that's where they don't quite know what they want to be yet. You'll hear very, very strong talk from leadership from the port saying they're moving forward with a system, or they're going to move forward with standards, or they're going to do this, but they don't have control really over the participants. And so, for instance, when the Port of Los Angeles unveiled its quote-unquote port optimizer, they tried to twist arms and get folks to participate, but at the end of the day, there wasn't a mechanism other than reopening folks' leases and forcing it in there almost as an HOA type agreement to participate. And what makes it even more complicated is when you have joint port authorities like the Port of Long Beach being right next door, who said, that's cute, but we're going in a different direction altogether. We don't agree with the way that you're pursuing this, and we're going to look at other alternatives. And from a port authority's perspective, I think there's a lot of attention on them. They're huge quasi-governmental agencies. The pressure a lot of times is coming down on the Port Authority from the White House and from Congress, but they really don't make any real decisions when it comes to operations. And the only way that happens is if they take a fundamental shift and they decide to become a semi-operating port. But I think then they've got themselves into a tough predicament, because they've got these long land leases with tenants who have put major multi-billion-dollar capital investments into these terminals. And the argument back, and I'm sure Jack, you'll chime in here, but the argument back is, give me the tools to be successful, build the infrastructure, build the roads, build the digital infrastructure, build the pipeline to convey data. Don't tell me how to do it. And from their perspective, you've got 12 marine terminal operators, for instance, in the Port of LA Long Beach. They're all working within their silo and self-optimizing. The role of the Port Authority is to try to get that to work at a macro level. And the solution that I'm trying to solve, and Todd's trying to solve, and Larry's trying to solve is, how do we take, and Joel, is how do we take the 13,000 trucks that are coming in and out that are operating in 12 unique ecosystems and have a single ecosystem experience that allows us to get better asset utilization and more capacity in the network. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think we've had the evolution from do nothing, just negotiate leases, to start to try to influence. But I think the ports themselves view their role as more of a convener and a thought leader, and they're trying to get industry to come to the same conclusions or to spark the conversation to get to conclusions. I don't think we are at the precipice of them becoming more hands-on, and a big part of that is they're political appointees, and there's a good chance a year from now we have a new executive director at the Port of Los Angeles, and probably within a year or two the same in the Port of Long Beach.
Jack, what's working around the country from a port authority level? I mean, you touch a lot of different places around the globe, but let's stay domestic. What's working from a supportive port authority perspective for you guys?
Yeah, I think, well, if you take the current situation, right, and hopefully this is not the state of affairs that is long-lived, right? But I think one of the things that the port authorities have done, which has been helpful, is they've moved much quicker when it comes to making any parcel of land possible, available to help ease some of the burden at the terminals themselves, right? So transactions that would have taken, 3 years of negotiations to get, 4 acres of land turned over so we could stack some containers there, are now getting done in weeks, right? And this is much improved. So I think their ability to help find outlets for some of the congestion has been good. I think the conversation starters around how can they help find common ground to make the entire ecosystem work better is a good direction for them to go in without forcing the onus onto any one party to have to do something, right? I mean, the way this is ultimately going to work is that they're going to get a bunch of people together who have a good idea that people can then sign on to for mutual benefit, right? The path of, just telling somebody they got to do this is not going to work out well. And what I would say is that when you compare this to what we see globally, I think depending on which part of the world you're in, you have ports that are much more concerned about their enablement of trade for their local communities and for the countries, to be perfectly blunt, than they are about maximizing political gain or revenue. And I think that all these things can be done in balance, but I think sometimes the headlines are more important than actually getting down to problem solving, and this is when we could do better collectively.
So what's an example of a port authority relationship that's working, where they facilitate things? I mean, would you point to Savannah, where they operate more of their facilities, or give us another example where it's working?
I think if you go to some of the smaller ports around the world, so one example for us typically is in Mobile, Alabama. So small port, right, by compared to LA Long Beach standards, but incredibly aligned set of end goals between the port, the local community, ourselves, and the political apparatus that surrounds those local communities, right? So
What's different in Mobile that you can't do or you struggle to do in LA?
I think it's the speed of decision making, and also the concern. In LA, you have a real you've got to be very careful about the fact there are 12 operators in LA Long Beach, right? So the demand for fair play makes it a difficult operating environment. You also
Political bullshit, that's what he said.
And I think we've proven that point solutions don't necessarily work. So if you solve one problem, or you try and tell the ports to stay open 24 hours, it doesn't solve the interconnected solutions that need to be considered. And I think you go to some of those smaller ports, you get a single operator, you take a lot of the complexity out of it, but it's also the reason that you need to have, a more, we're digitized here, right? This is our digitization event. And by providing more of that visibility and having that transparency in some of those smaller ports, they're able to enact that. Yeah. Whereas you've got different solutions for different terminals in a different port. And all of a sudden, if you're a trucking company, you've got to work with each of the ports, each of the terminals, and each of those solutions is different. And it just is screaming for somebody to come in and say, how about if we try and have a more universal approach to some of these challenges?
So I think the one thing to take in notice, and Jack touched on this, but the larger the port complex, the more bureaucratic it is, right? fundamentally, and if you even look at the big difference in the issues between how LA and Long Beach approach digitizing the supply chain, LA went full bore down one road. However, the largest competitor had the same parent company as half of the terminals on the Long Beach side, and they weren't invited to the original dance, and that created a political issue that, I think long term, the approach that the Port of Long Beach is taking is very valid because they're trying to be more of a data standard and data purveyor. They're trying to become that aspect. But that political dynamic made it so the two authorities couldn't work together. And the other big thing is where you see it be successful is where there's a commercial lens being paid attention by the Port Authority. Because when you have a Port Authority in a place like New York, New Jersey, or LA Long Beach, where you have these highly charged political climates around them, we used to call them NIMBYs, and now we call them cave people, citizens against virtually everything. And you have folks that protest all of the yards that Joel's talking about, everything. When you have a Port Authority that understands that their bottom line and their ability to do good for that community that they're talking about is really tied into the commercial viability of the stakeholders, the tenants that are leasing the land, and they give more latitude for them to be able to operate well but create standards or a common set of rules, is where we need to get to. And I think that's what Jack was saying. They want the headline. They want the headline to say, Port of wherever is working together to bring stakeholders to a uniform process. But all they want is that headline. And the rest of it's really about, hey, I need to build a Little League field for the local congressperson. You can't build that because the union doesn't like it, even though it'll make everything work a lot more efficiently. We aren't going to invest in data over here because people don't understand the difference between artificial intelligence and RFID tags, which I hope people know what an RFID tag is, and artificial intelligence, at least. It's not trucking. But that's part of the issue. And when you have folks that are in their job for, in some cases, decades, and all they have to do is not screw it up, it's easier for them to say no and move slowly than it is to actually try to be innovative, which is what we're all trying to do in this room.
Good stuff. We've seen a lot of shipping lines, usually, if it works, in partnership with marine terminal operators, launching these premium services, which to my eyes kind of look like almost like the clear lane at the airport. If you want to pay $100 more, you don't have to wait in line behind Joe Schmo. What do you think about this, Jack? Are these things working? Does APMT do anything like that, where you're offering for a fee the ability to get your cargo out in some kind of guaranteed window? And is this helping the problem, or is it just adding to it?
So yes, to answer the straight question, we are doing these types of things. So we have what we call peel-off piles, and we've got specific gates for specific truckers that guarantee a certain amount of turn time. And I think when done right, we can add a tremendous amount of value to the end customer because of the fact that we can be so much more efficient with both labor and the machinery that we have. I think that when you relate this to the fast pass lanes on the highway, right? I mean, you can remember when they first came out, and there were one or two of them lanes that were fast pass, and everybody else was still handing over cash or coins to the toll taker, and you'd be sitting in that toll line watching these cars driving past you at 55 miles an hour. And eventually it gets to the point now where, at least on the Pennsylvania Turnpike where my parents live, right, there's no toll takers at all. And even if you don't have the fast pass, they're just using cameras to send you the toll. And what you've seen happen over time is not that the capacity of the road has changed in terms of the number of lanes, but the free flow of cars through the system has increased dramatically. So when done right, I think that these types of premium services can move to become more of the norm, right? So the real benefit for us is the fact that we get so much more utilization out of our equipment so much better. But the onus is actually on the importer and the trucking company to make sure that everything is completely right from their side before they show up at our gate. And when they do that, right? That takes a lot of the trouble, a lot of the friction out of the transaction for us, and then we can move cargo much quicker. So I think when done right, they can be a big help, and it's my hope that more of this becomes the norm than the exception.
You know, Alan, we've done these types of projects now in 8 different seaports in the last year, and it's worked very effectively. We've done importer-driven ones, so we have a large importer in Seattle where we do a 48-hour discharge, meaning everything's off the vessel in 48 hours and it's delivered within the course of a week, 500 to 600 containers. That means that the terminal doesn't get impacted. That dwell time becomes non-existent. We're doing one in the Port Hueneme with a partnership with FedEx where they're actually bringing over what were empty containers, spending $3 million to bring over empty equipment. They're now filling that up with a chassis. It's a 53-foot, what you would see normally on rail. And that's the same thing. It all comes off within 48 hours. It's delivered to customer within a week, guaranteed. And we have 2 that we're doing regularly in Southern California, where we're moving 600 containers every other week to an off-dock, meaning a terminal outside of the port, staged on wheels for customers to come pick up, or we can deliver it. We have both a push and a pull model. And we just inked a deal with a company where we'll actually be scaling up, moving 2,500 containers a week off dock for customers to come pick up. And I bring this up because the faster you get it off the dock and make it accessible for the customer, the less chance you have of it getting stuck at a terminal and dealing with issues around not having enough labor allocation to work a section of the yard or having to dig it out and move 6 containers to get to 1. And I do think what you've seen is almost you're looking back to what worked a decade ago. Smaller vessels, more agile vessels, the ability to get cargo off quickly. It doesn't work for everybody because some folks are more cost conscious. But when you look at the landed cost versus the rate, a lot of times that value proposition is there to move 500 a week very quickly, as opposed to being part of a vessel that has 15,000 containers on it and getting access to it when you get access to it.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that. I agree with both of you. Peel piles, I think, rapid movement of the goods off the port, hitting those appointments. But we all know that that's only part of the problem, right? What you have, like I said before, is you've got congestion building up at the DCs. And so I think the local governments have to start allowing these more satellite yards, smart depots be created so that you can also have that relief valve, if you will, to at least get it out off the port, break the congestion there, and do the hub and spoke thing. I mean, I'm an ex-FedEx guy, right? So, I mean, hub and spoke is in my blood. And I think that the intermodal industry is going to have to adopt some sort of hub and spoke approach as a relief valve. You're not going to totally eliminate the direct, but at least use that hub and spoke to help provide a resting place when you need it, to help with the congestion with the DCs and to free up the wheels, because you need those chassis to continue to move other stuff.
And that's all a part of a coordinated effort across the supply chain. What got me interested in founding Matchback Systems was a decade ago, I was managing hundreds of thousands of import containers that would come into the United States at 7 different gateways. And I saw this black hole. They're just things that I didn't know. But the customers that we would work with, they had all of the data they needed to start managing this process. So if you think about an import or an inbound operation, they've got all this information on when it's departing the origin country, when it's supposed to be delivered, when is customs going to get cleared. There's 20 or 30 milestones that you can actually manage. And by having the information and the data and synchronizing all that, ultimately you can take time out of the supply chain because people are going to have more confidence, people are going to know where their products are, and they're going to be able to manage it better. And so I was managing this operation, and we had a lot of work going on in Chicago. And I'm trying to figure out, how can we coordinate, do I have enough trucks to get it delivered back to the rail terminal? And a trucker calls me up and says, Todd, I see you've got that Maersk box sitting there. I'd like it. And I'm thinking, I would love to have this capacity, but I can't afford to pay him because now I'm going to be upside down in this. And he goes, I'll give you $35 to pick that up. And I thought, that dude knows something that I don't know. on how to reuse that container. But it's all part of that synchronization that has to happen in that supply chain for people to be able to optimize it.
We talked about it at the beginning. Someone mentioned the airlines, right, and rescheduling. The airlines figured this out. They're sharing data with each other. And maybe that's something that the Envase group can help us figure out. How can we become more like the airlines and freely share information?
Yeah, that's what Larry keeps all of us up at night thinking about. You know, you've got a tremendous marketplace here. Uber is, you know, the most easily comparable. You know, you've got a continually fluctuating pool of driver capacity. When that supply's there, costs are down. When it's not, costs go up. You have big events, you have more drivers coming on, but everybody's paid more. Do you think, and I don't know if everybody knows the term spot market, but the spot market kind of shows us the oh my God, I got to get this box moved today. What do I have to pay to get it done? That price now is kind of the new normal for local drayage.
If you can get it moved. And so I think it's interesting because we are a marketplace and we, at this point in time, don't touch spot market freight. So it's very interesting because when you think of marketplaces, a lot of folks think of these long-haul trucking operations like Convoy and Uber Freight, and that's exactly what they do. You post your load on, and then folks bid on it, and then they lose money because they underwrite the cost of it, and their valuation goes up. I don't know how you continue to make more money by losing more, but that's for you all in the room, in the investment side of the house. But we actually have our marketplace as more of I call it more of a Match.com, less of a Tinder service. Instead of swiping right and swiping left on freight that's popped up in the market, we're comparing our carrier base with the lanes that our customers are populating with us, and we're moving, you know, thousands of containers a week in pretty much every seaport market and rail ramp in the country now. But because we're creating consistent capacity and we're managing maybe 3 or 4 small carriers for a large customer, as opposed to them having to go out and find one company that can do that, which you bring up spot market, but most people don't even want to touch it because of the work that's involved in it. That's why I think it's so much higher in the cost is I'm getting really good rates to do things every day where the freight's there, all I have to do is show up and move it. Why do I want to recreate the wheel every single day? It better be really lucrative for me to be able to do that.
Do you see do you see this having a shift to more owner-operators because they're able to, you know, kind of plan their own day, be home at night, have a known set of work hours, kind of like an Uber driver has? Do you see that coming?
There's 2 big shifts that we've seen over the last year, and I shouldn't call them shifts, we've just seen them accelerated. The first is more and more truck drivers want to stay local. So again, I talked about we localize trucking. We try to operate within a 150-mile air radius of some geographic node, whether it's a seaport, a rail ramp, or a large city where we're moving freight around it. And last year, a lot of capacity growth for us might be from a carrier with 100 trucks who said, I've got 10 drivers that said they won't go long haul anymore. They'll only go local. And so we went in and re-credentialed them. We got them their Quick Card to go in and out of ports. We got them UIIA certified to go in and out of rail ramps. Don't worry about that letters. This industry has a bunch of them. But essentially, we redeployed power from long haul to short haul. And why is that also big is because asset utilization. With 500 trucks in a market, I can move 1,500 movements a day, where those same 500 for a convoy, they need 500 new drivers every single day to be able to move those same 500. So you're getting a bigger bang for your buck by creating the hub and spoke that Joel's talking about. The other thing that we've seen is several years ago, California adopted a law called Assembly Bill 5, which essentially a lot of people thought was the end of the owner-operator. All it meant is a driver could not lease on as a 1099 independent contractor to a motor carrier. And federal standards say you have to do that for at least 120 consecutive days. So essentially, for 6 months out of the year, they're locked in with that one motor carrier. California said you can still work with them, but they have to be their own independent business, and that's essentially why the brokerage model has taken off with what Joel talked about. We have over 35,000 trucks on our platform nationwide, and a lot of that are folks that were 1099s in markets like Georgia and in markets like South Carolina who've said, I'm going to go be my own business, but you've given me a digital business in a box. All I have to do is say what I want to do and show up and move the freight, and we're creating digital truck fleets.
Yeah, the problem though is that all those thousands of truckers that have done that, and we applaud them for doing that, they all want to communicate on their terms. Every one of them's got a different style, a different comfort level of technology that they're willing to adopt in their business. And so the trick is being able to communicate with them on their channel. It could be various different degrees.
Give
Another
us an
thing
example
for
of that.
Envase to help figure out and provide those various different flavors of communication to those companies.
Joel, give us an example.
Well, I mean,
of
like
how two owner operators may want to do business
so
with you differently.
we've gone in, and I know Link to Open is in here. They do focus TMS on small carriers, but we've got some companies where we've gone and said, "Hey, we'll buy a TMS for you if you'll use it." And they're like, "Nope, I only want to use my Excel spreadsheet," or "I only want to use your website," and so you have to provide all these different flavors. You just can't just do one because everyone is different.
We have 4 different ways we communicate with drivers. We have our mobile app, which works really well in the domestic short haul freight market. Think less than truckload, full truckload, driving box trucks and 53 foots around a town. We have our carrier portal where they can upload things because maybe they have a dispatcher or two. We do integrations with larger carriers where we're sharing things via API or EDI. And then we've got a lot of people in South America who we get the Excel spreadsheet and they're doing data entry and they're taking what should be an automated process that we have all the tools for, but they've created a manual solution for it. And the reason you have to do that is you're basically stuck with the paradigm of, do I do this manually or do I just not grow as a company? And we would rather get things done and then work with folks to educate them on the tools we have and how much easier things are. Like if you're using our app, you're going to get paid in 7 days. If you're doing things manually, it's going to take 30 days. Still good payment terms, but 7 days to get your money is a lot better than 30 days.
That's right.
And so it's about education at that point in time. But I think, Joel, what you're talking about is very real in this industry, which is there's a lot of aversion to technology. It's interesting because there was an article in Business Insider called about app fatigue, and one of the big things that I talked about was if you find the right technology partner, they'll do all the integrations for you, and you only have to live in one app. The problem is that a lot of folks they're busy downloading the APM Terminals app and the Union Pacific app and every company that you've heard of, and they haven't realized that there are partners out there that can become that one source of truth for them, both inbound and outbound on the technology. And I think that's
right.
where we have to go as an industry, is educating folks and really pushing towards standardization.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, everybody should have the APM Terminals app, right? I mean,
That's the only one I use.
I mean, it's universally recognized, right? But I think importantly, what we're getting at here is everybody wants to live in their own little environment, right? And the solutions that we need are the things that allow everybody to stay in their own environment, but are able to see all that information from all the different silos that are out there, right? And it's that type of platforming, configurations and APIs and everything else that comes along with it that doesn't mean that dispatcher X at company Y now has to give up whatever TMS or whatever dispatch system they're in to be able to have the visibility that we're talking about. The data is there, right? There's not a lack of data right now. It's the issue of democratizing the transparency of it, and that's what we need to work at.
How do you think data is going to, we've talked about connections with these motor carriers, whether it's through a mobile app or other means, whether that's to the driver or to the people dispatching these loads. It's all about bringing them into this digital network, okay? Where do you see this going from a just a solution to help solve this capacity? If more people, to go back to the toll road scenario, Jack, if more people sitting waiting to pay a toll taker and they want to get home and throw ball with Jimmy before the sun goes down, and they're is that going to be the driver to get them onto this kind of digital landscape, or do the tools just have to be so user friendly that that, that they'll adopt?
It's two things. If you look at the average age on the trucking side, the average age of a truck driver is in their early 50s. They don't want to learn a new thing because they don't plan on working that much longer. So there's part of it, I think, is really about working with newer entries. There's an element of making it accessible to everybody, but it's really about getting the low-hanging fruit, which is the newer entries that want ease of use. And I think you would agree the newer drivers we see coming in are way more technology friendly, and they embrace it. And then I think the other part is, where are the hurdles in the network that create issues around data? And I'm looking at Jack because they've got some workers out there that don't want automation, they don't want digitization. And so there's elements of overcoming workforce, not just from a truck driver who says, I don't really want to do work with an app, but complete labor forces who say, manual's better, give me a clipboard and there'll be no slowdowns at the port. And the fact of the matter is the best technology doesn't work without real data. And so part of it is working towards the workforce of the future at every level of the supply chain. We need automation. We don't have enough talent in the labor pool to be able to fill all the jobs that would be out there if we tried to make them very manual. And then the last part is at the federal level are the data standards. The Federal Maritime Commission's launching their data standards committee. I'm going to sit on that, and I'm excited to see what that could become, because I actually think it really is just about standards and rules. And we all know about the micro USB. We know that plugs into your computer unless you use Apple products like I do, but at least they have one every time they launch a computer that fits that computer. But if you look at across the board, we were on a panel 5 years ago talking about APIs at TPM, and then nobody had an API. What's an API? I've never heard of an API. 3 years later on that same panel, I've got an API. Oh, I've got an API too. It was the API to nowhere though, because instead of having a standard set of APIs that's open source that anybody can just connect in and share data with, everybody has to engineer the API to hook up with the open API that's not really open. And so we've created a lot more work, because instead of getting together and saying, what is the data that we want to convey? How do we want it presented to make sure that it's sanitized? And what is the conveyance? How does that look? We went out and talked about, partially I'll take blame for this, throwing out words like big data and API and integration. Everybody went home and did it, but they didn't talk to anybody else in the community. And so it's about ease of use at the same time.
When you look across the industry, though, every trucker and every shipper is at a different level of technical sophistication. And some of them absolutely can work with APIs. And like you said, Weston, we're the same way. We have people that still want a spreadsheet sent to them with the answers, because that fits their workflow. And here in the near term, you have to meet those people where they're at. But I also agree with your app fatigue. We are very focused on being the industry standard for the reuse of the container. I have a portal. I don't care if nobody comes to the portal. What I care is that we are that engine that is fueling that reuse of that container in the industry. So if I have to have APIs to connect to people's TMSs, if I have to have APIs that go to a shipper's operating system or to a port terminal, we have the ability to be able to do that, or what other technology that they want to do, because we want to meet those users where they're at. And that's why some of the things that have been discussed here are exciting, but it's trying to find that solution that works for the masses.
So we got about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure we've got time for questions. So before we wrap here, I'd like you guys to give the audience the single takeaway that you want them to walk out of this room with about this industry, about what's next and what they can do to really move that needle forward. Joel, we'll start with you before we open it up to questions.
Well, I think that we probably said it up here is that we've got all this audience here. I think we've pretty much were handpicked to come here today, and it's going to take a combination of infrastructure change, process change, and technology change. Technology cannot do it by itself. It's got to be all three of these things that have to work in conjunction. And that's going to take all of us collaborating together, to produce solutions that seamlessly will interface with each other. We're going to have to start thinking out of the box. We can't just keep trying to do things in the bottle. If we've got a bottleneck, it's going to be a bottleneck. How do we break that bottleneck? How do we do things like hub and spoke, do more peel piles, get more fluidity into our industry? And we're going to probably have to have some state and local government participation as well in that to make all that happen.
Jack?
Yeah, so it's a tough one for me to answer to be specific about, but there's a couple things that I see and I think they're important. So the first thing is I think we need to recognize that we are the industry is a bunch of Luddites, right? I mean, this is not an industry that's known for its forward-thinking vision. And I think, so we need to accept that and understand where people are today when we start talking about trying to make this change. And so I would encourage that we not get too hung up on 5-year vision and worry a little bit about what we can fix in the next 18 months, right? So when we're building solutions or when we're thinking about, that next great leap, to me, this is like an 18-month problem, not a 5-10-year look, because we are so far behind the rest of the world. The second thing that I'd say is that if I look at where our terminals in the U.S. perform best, and this is common across the globe, the places where it works best is where we have the highest level of shared understanding around the data between us and the customer. So whether it be us in the steamship line or us in the trucking company or the BCO that's controlling the goods, right? So whenever there is 100% alignment on what the facts are, that creates the best operations we have. It's a fact that's true across the board.
So transparency about the metrics of the business, basically.
Well, not even just the metrics, but what's where, when, and how. And it's the visibility. And all that, as I said before, all the data is there. It's just a matter of how you put it together to keep everybody the same situational awareness.
Todd?
Intermodal is the last optimization opportunity in the supply chain. There are significant opportunities to run intermodal operations more effectively. Today, 95% of all delivering containers to an importer come back empty. 95% of all exports get picked up from a ramp or a yard or a terminal and go out empty and come back loaded. If you can connect those opportunities, you're going to eliminate between $150 and $400 of direct transportation cost, another couple $100 of indirect transportation costs where people have to gate it, check it, they've got to lift it, they've got to store it. But there's another piece of this, it's also sustainable. You're going to eliminate over 400 pounds of emissions every time that you can connect that triangulation. And by doing that, by doing 5 of those, you're going to save a metric ton of emissions. So I think it's both the optimization opportunity, and then I think there's a strong sustainability play that we're big advocates for.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I would hope you all leave here with is the fact that the industry that we're in is the most essential industry in the world because no other industry can function without it. And I think for far too long we've been looked at as the redheaded stepchild of business and drayage and intermodal of the supply chain, but quite frankly, there is nothing that you all do that isn't impacted by trucking and supply chain and logistics. And I think moving forward, it's going to be driven by technology and data, and that's where you all come into play, because the great thing about an industry that is slow to adopt but is extremely essential is when you make an investment, it allows for you as an investor to have a lot more control in how you get yields on that investment. If you invested in a new cell phone, by the time it comes out, it's obsolete. However, in our industry, as Jack was saying, the reason we have to break it down into 18 months is because of how quickly we actually need to move to solve these problems, but in actuality, it'll probably be a 5-year rollout of what should be accomplished in 18 months. And the last thing I would say as you're investing is don't be afraid of assets. I think far too often people look at companies and they want them to be assetless or asset light. And I'll tell you, a lot of our growth, we started without assets. We bought an asset division for $2 million in 2019, and it's going to do $80 million this year, just our asset division. So there's nothing wrong with owning assets if it helps you drive your technology and it helps you get the yields that you're looking for from an investment standpoint. And it took us a little while to get there with our investors to have them say, you're really a technology company, you should only be doing technology plays, to, hey, we grew this company 40 times in a 2.5-year period. That materially helped us not just grow that part of our bottom line, but our macro bottom line. And now we're going to be making a lot more investments in acquisitions around the country to be able to have strategic assets where we find that we need them most. So do not be afraid of investing in this industry, and don't be afraid of walking through the business plan and being open to the idea of hard assets to help make the software work better.
Good stuff. Questions before we break for coffee? Chris, let's go here. I'll come down and.
I forget which one of you guys mentioned it, but I think this was the number. 12 port operators in Long Beach?
Yeah, LA Long Beach has 12 container terminal operators.
And so I would imagine that contributes to the chaos. That can't be inefficient. So how did that happen? I mean, that just sounds like a horrible idea. Long Beach started off as a Navy base, and when the Navy left, they said, what can we do with this? And they started divvying up land, and LA started adding land with infill. And so APM terminals 50 years ago didn't exist. What was this, the 80s, 90s? The 90s it actually opened up. And so essentially they just kept building infrastructure, and ocean carriers would come in and say, I'll take that one, I need a terminal to control myself. And that's really how it happened. Is most of the marine terminals were a lot of them still do have relationships with ocean carriers. The private equity has gotten very much in the mix. But if you go back 10 years, they were all dedicated to a single steamship line, and that was what the arrangement was. So if I've got blue boats, I wanted my blue terminal, and I bring in my blue containers, and that's turned into an Easter egg hunt, because as the ships got larger, they did these vessel sharing arrangements, and now instead of having 12 unique terminals that are dedicated to a unique supply chain, you have 12 unique terminals that are in a shared supply chain situation, which has created a lot of the confluence in the industry. It doesn't make sense. Don't even try to figure it out.
But think about it at an airport. You're going to walk in, right? You're going to have the United gates, you're going to have the American gates, and the Delta gates, all under the same port authority that's operating the
Except
airline.
think about it from JFK's perspective. If you have to go from a United flight to a Delta flight, you have to leave and go back through
There you go.
security at some other. Makes no sense. Most other places have connected it so you can at least walk from the United area to the Delta area without having to go through security again. In LA Long Beach, we haven't figured out how to do that yet.
And does that fall on the Port Authority's shoulders to kind of fix that? Because it just seems to me, you talk about the bullwhip effect throughout the supply chain. Start there. How does that get fixed?
I think it's a little. I would frame the situation differently. I mean, the first thing is, what's the problem you're trying to solve, right? And taking away the ability for an operator to maximize the efficiencies of their supply chain for their customers is probably not where I would start. I think there's the problem that we're talking about can be solved regardless of how many different terminal operators you have in LA. It's going to be more difficult, but the technology and the transparency and the issues that we've raised here today, I think are going to get to a much quicker and more sustainable solution than trying to undo 70 years of historic growth in Southern California.
Yeah, I think that's where data standards, common rules come into play. And, we throw this term around. Instead of vertical integration, it's virtual integration. It's having something that seems very vertical, but it's all connected through integrations and through data and common platforms. And I think that's really the way forward. The tough thing is when your containers come into one terminal and then they go back to a different terminal, but that's not where your imports are. That's where a lot of this
congestion comes from, because you're always trying to play the matchmaking game, right? It's like as a kid, the tiles, where you're trying to figure out which one matches this one. That's every day what's going on in these port complexes, is you're trying to figure out where I can take something back, where I can pick something up, how do I thread the needle to do it at the same time so I can move two things with one truck and one chassis. And it's not as easy as you would think, because you've got all these different flavors of containers out there, and they need to go to a certain spot to get sent back to Asia to get loaded again, but they're not necessarily where you need to pick things up. And this is where the alliances, the shipping alliances, right, have done a great job of sharing their vessels to bring things over. They need to do a better job of sharing their terminals, so there is that landside lock that goes along with it. And I think Maersk has done one of the best jobs, because you've simplified your alliance. There's only 2 terminals that you're going to go in and out of. In LA Long Beach, some of these alliances, you may go in and out of 6 different plus terminals to pick up and drop off cargo without really knowing where something can go back until the day of. And that's the issue. So data, technology, common rules, virtual integration, that's really what we need.
I guess for the audience, a little context back to the airline space. LA Long Beach works today. Imagine an airport where you showed up without a ticket, you would have a destination, but you don't necessarily have a ticket, and you want to get on a plane without an ID. That's kind of what happens at a lot of LA Long Beach area terminals. People show up, there's 100 boxes that they could pick up for that day. They're not exactly sure where they're going, so they're just sitting parked, waiting to see if they can pass the barrier to entry. Something is available. Is there an appointment for it? Am I late? Am I early? All of that happens because people are pulling the levers, and that's what's so exciting about, Matchback, about Cargomatic. Obviously, Envase, this is what we do every day, trying to put the digital connection into the hands of the drivers, and especially the dispatchers and logistics coordinators that make those things happen. People are doing this manually. It's better than it was 5 years ago, but it's still a somewhat manual process. And our goal, I think, collectively with everybody on the stage, is to how to make sure that nobody's looking for data. They're not looking for information on where their box is. They're not manually scheduling a reservation to pick it up. They're not manually paying a fee, and eventually they're not looking to see how to assign loads to drivers. The systems just do it automatically, but we're not there today. Other questions? I think we got time for a couple more.
Hey there, I'm Stephanie Martin. I'm with OneRail. I did have a question around the standardization of data, especially with what we saw with IBM and Maersk doing trade lens and everything. Do you think that's the beginning, us getting more standardization around the data so everybody can use a common platform that has open APIs with the same in and outs? Because I feel like that's something we're all challenged with. I mean, we're in last mile logistics. We see it every day. But with other companies I've been with, that's always the struggle.
I think it's better than it was a couple of years ago, so we're headed in the right direction. It really comes down to, it's not that the tools don't exist, right? It really comes down to people participating. And I think that's where the issues have come into play. I think the other thing is, we love to bring in these large companies that have resources, but they don't always understand the problems that we're trying to solve for. So, several years ago, I got the chance to judge a hackathon at USC, and we'd give the kids data sets, and then we'd have them come up with solutions. And to me, it was always interesting because they came up with great solutions based on the data sets, but they didn't know how the industry worked. So, to put it very simply, they thought, well, just have a truck show up and the container come off the ship and right on a truck and off it'll go. Well, yeah, that sounds great in theory, but it doesn't work. And I think that's also the issue we see with a lot of the technology solutions is, before coming to Cargomatic, I was CEO of the Harbor Trucking Association for 7 years, and I did a brief stint in some venture capital working with very early stage companies. And it was really about trying to get them to understand the problems the industry needed to solve and how to make a business out of that. And I think that some of these are very solvable problems, but maybe not commercial yet. You can't commercialize them. And other ones, there may be a business around, but it doesn't really solve the problem that the industry needs. And so I think we're headed in the right direction. I think what it really just comes down to is folks are going to have to move forward, and I think that a lot of the people in this room are doing that, and leave everybody else behind. Because if we try to drag people kicking and screaming with us, we're going to slow down our progress. I would rather just continue to grow and continue to change the industry. And if somebody goes out of business because of that, oh well, that happened to Kodak, it happened to Blockbuster, it happens to a lot of companies that aren't willing to be part of the innovative culture, and our industry is ready to be revolutionized, and for those that don't see it, bye.
I think one of the bigger challenges you're going to run into with the standardization process is you're going to get these big vessels that are moving, and you're going to be able to track them. You're going to get the operations at the terminal, and you're going to be able to track them, and then you get to the truck. And you've got how many trucks are operating, how many trucking companies?
Just in and out of the ports of LA Long Beach, roughly 1,800 individual trucking companies.
Individual trucking companies and 13,000 drivers, and each of them is at a different spot. So when you talk to some of those companies that are trying to standardize some of the process, they're able to get the big pieces of the supply chain, but it's that last mile that becomes incredibly challenging for them to figure out. Even with some of the new technology that's come in, you know, with the ELDs, it still becomes difficult with some of the truckers that are staying hyper local. They aren't required to have that technology, so there's no way to track them. And a lot of times they're very unsophisticated. You know, I came from a trucking company that had 20,000 drivers, and they were, you know, in the domestic world, and they had, you know, a fraction of the industry. Joel has 3,000 trucks access to, 2,000 that he owns, and, you know, it's a very fragmented industry in trying to capture, especially that last mile.
Yeah, hi. I just have a quick question about a very specific piece of equipment that I've seen recently, collapsible containers. And so I'm just curious, especially for the gentleman with Matchback, I imagine on the one hand that looks good, but on the other hand, at least for your business, it's not necessarily. But from purposes of efficiency, right, that's a roughly 4-to-1 scale. Is there hesitancy in the industry to adopt a physical asset like that and start manufacturing them and using them?
If you look at the flow of trade, there's absolutely an opportunity for equipment like that. I personally think it's going to be a challenge just with the scale and the order that has to go. And if you couple in all the complexity that's out there, you know, which terminal do these end up with? I know from, you know, our research and everything you're going to read in the industry, 2/3 of the displacement of equipment is due to the fact that the equipment is company owned. So if you've got a blue container and you've got a pink pickup, those don't work. But if you have the gray box, like you're talking about, you're going to get a lot more optimization and a lot more opportunity to reuse it. So there's something there, you know, and we actually welcome that type of innovation because you're right, you're going to get one move and be able to move forward them. I think the infrastructure to support all that is probably one of the bigger challenges right now.
And I know there was a question down here. If you could put wheels on the container, I'll take all of them.
Morning, guys. Great panel. My name is Miles Varghese, cargologic.com. And going back to the FMC question and the data standardization that they're working towards, tactically, what do you guys see as the solution there, right? Is it going to be private? Is it going to be public? Is it going to be just like a pure API provider? Is it going to be a services provider too on the back end? I'm curious to get your guys' perspective on that.
Yeah, so June 1st will be the kickoff meeting. You're calling it the Data Standards Summit, and I think more will come out of that. But in conversations I've had with members of the Federal Maritime Commission, I think they see what a lot of people do, which is this mishmash of solutions that don't fit together and a complete lack of visibility, either because data doesn't exist in certain instances, like Todd's talking about, where some drivers don't need to have technology and they don't want it in their cabs, or folks aren't sharing the data. I really think a lot of it comes out of what you've seen in LA Long Beach, them going down disparate paths. My understanding is they don't want to become prescriptive. They don't want to tell people how to do it. What they want to do is create a common set of, basically a checklist of the things that you need to accomplish with visibility. And my guess is that they'll try to tie it to some sort of infrastructure funding. So they're going to put the onus on port authorities and local governments to hold people accountable to a certain level of standards. but not get so prescriptive so that Jack comes back and says, well, we've already invested millions of dollars in our technology. Why should we change it because somebody else is behind on the evolution here? So more to come there, but I think they're trying to walk the tightrope of how do we become an enabler and let people know what needs to be done to make this successful, less about choosing a vendor or socializing the flow of data. It's about creating standards and access.
I think there's a little bit of reason to be optimistic that one day this gets done. So the carriers now globally, the major steamship lines that are operating, have actually already started down this journey of standardizing the data that gets transmitted between them and their customer base. So things like a bill of lading and what that standard message set looks like for that, and ultimately they'll get to a booking. But so I think that there is enough of a common understanding that this is a problem out there that you are going to start to see people who were previously competitors be able to collaborate on this type of effort. So I would actually be fairly hopeful. Now, the FMC will see if they can be the arbiter of progress, but I think that there is room for optimism.
Other questions? One more.
We got one in the back over there. You're getting your steps in.
Yeah, this is kind of like the efficiency of
Oh, that's all right.
This is what it's like to pick up and drop off at a Marine terminal.
Hi there. Thank you. My name is Dennis Rourke. I'm with AGC Partners, and if there's one thing that the panel today has made abundantly clear is that the ecosystem in the U.S. around ports, terminal operating systems, and the related drayage is very inefficient, poorly managed, barely able to keep up with the commerce that is coming in and out of the country to address our consumers in the country today. And there are many reasons for that, and you guys have covered many of the reasons that we're in this state today. One of the bigger ones is lack of investment and lack of capital in the infrastructure, whether it's technology, whether it's physical infrastructure, is a big part of the problem today. And so my question is, if you look at other parts of the world where those investments have been made, are being made in the infrastructure, so you think of ports in China, ports in Singapore, to a lesser extent, ports in Northern Europe, Rotterdam, Bremen, they're doing really interesting things and investing in the infrastructures to make their ecosystems better. Are there any lessons that we can take from what best-in-class ports are doing to make our systems better?
Yeah, I think you can just even look in Los Angeles and Long Beach as you look at investments. We've got 3 terminals that have some sort of automation. You got Long Beach Container Terminal, which is fully automated and is the closest thing to a zero emissions terminal you'll have. Macquarie bought it for, what, $2.5 billion roughly. But what they've done is simplified the truck transaction essentially, right? So we talk about peel off, and peel off is just no different than you put a stack of containers. The last container that goes on is the first one that comes off, and it's like a taxi cab service. It's not container specific. So they're doing that same effect because they're always grooming that pile. They have an algorithm, and they're using AI to know what's coming and when it's coming. And so trucks can get in and out of there, usually with queue and everything, within 40 minutes. What APM Terminals is doing with their new Project M, they've actually figured out how to do it, and this is probably why the longshoremen aren't so happy, in a much more economical and less capital-intensive way, right? So they've taken, essentially you could take existing equipment, put an AI chip in it, and they bring the container to the gate as opposed to having a truck drive around a 400-acre terminal looking for it. So I think we've seen it already. The difficulty is that political bureaucratic process. So I think for a very long time, the issue was there wasn't enough investment in physical infrastructure, right? And part of it was because when ocean carriers, by and large, own terminals, most of them looked at it as a cost center. I just want to turn the ship around as quickly as possible because that's where I make my money. The more movement that ship has, the more money I make. the insurgence of private equity, investment in these terminals and acquisition of ownership, and then some more forward-thinking marine terminals that understand I need to have an efficient terminal to be able to move those ships, because once the terminal's full, I can't bring a ship in anyway, has been the big paradigm shift. The problem we have now isn't that folks don't have the plans or don't have investors lined up. It's that they can't get the permits. They cannot get the political will out of the way, because when you have 8,000 longshoremen that are in Southern California saying that robot's taking my job, and you have a bunch of political followers that get elected to office but won't stand up for what's right for the national economy, that's where you get into these issues. And instead of having conversations about the future of workforce and the fact that we need to automate because we don't have enough physical workers, they're instead making these guys jump through hoops. You may be the last real large-scale project that happens, depending on what happens in this next contract negotiation. So I think the difference between us and elsewhere is that they just do it. Whereas here, we have to go through a decade worth of analysis to understand whether it should be done. And by that point in time, it's antiquated.
And there's just one other thing to add that I think is a really good response, and touched on some things I probably couldn't have. But I think that the other thing that I see in infrastructures around the world is it's not just about that terminal or the marine terminal or the immediate access around it that those government-involved investments are thinking about. It's all the connectivity to and from it that actually enables a smooth operation there. So it's the roads, it's the rail, it's all the rest of that infrastructure. And for us, this is where we think government actually plays a more important role in terms of making the whole system more efficient, right? So it's the roads, it's the rail, and it's those types of investments where they can really make a difference to smoothing out the bumps in the supply chain.
If you look at the Port of Rotterdam, they actually have a centralized system for all of the data in and out of a state-owned entity in Port.
That's a novel idea.
Yeah, it's a great idea, isn't it? But they actually, and they also work, a taxi service with barges from terminal to terminal that's very synchronized. They have inland ports, that are on rail and barge, and it all runs through a centralized system. So if you're going to clear customs, if you're going to make a pickup, if you're going to have an appointment system, you're going to use this centralized platform to be able to manage through it. So that's one of the examples, I think, that where somebody's figured out how to digitize the process for us.
And I think maybe, sorry, and I know you want to wrap up, but just is one thing that I want to make clear. And if I think we gave the wrong impression, that's good. I would not say that the entire supply chain in and around ports and last mile is mismanaged or managed poorly. I think there are a lot of very well managed operations out there. What is not managed well is the connectivity between those parts. And I think that's an important distinction to make in terms of where the real solutions ultimately lie as well.
And you've got companies like IMC, Cargomatic, on the trucking side at least, that are getting better asset utilization. We're moving drivers faster. The problem is when you have an ecosystem, a lot of times you're stuck with the least common denominator as to where your standards are. And if somebody else is in front of me in the line and they're not integrated with the terminal and they've not let them know, we have something called pre-advise where it scans on our trucks, it scans it and it lets them know, okay, yep, Cargomatic truck, come on in, this is where it's going. If somebody else is standing there putting their token in the toll booth, it slows everything down behind it. And I think that's really the issue is we have the least common denominator paradigm that we're there trying to solve issues that people are manually creating when the solutions in many cases exist. We're just not utilizing them at the highest functionality.
And that's a good segue to end. There's a lot of things with connectivity that can be automated, but for the vast majority of folks who are on spreadsheets and flip phones, we got to make it look automated. We got to give them the tools that allow them to dip their toe into this process efficiency that the big guys have built. And therein lies the opportunity, because that's the biggest piece of the market, at least from the drayage perspective in the U.S., are those drivers with the 1 to 2 folks in a company, and they just want to be home at night, and that's kind of really where we're going to look to focus. Thanks for the questions, guys. Thank you very much for joining us and being so candid. We've got a 20-minute break for coffee, and then we're coming back for the e-commerce panel, so please stick around. Thank you.